Hi everyone, welcome back to class. Glad you're still hanging with us for econ. We are going to tackle chapter 9 today. Chapter 9 is another application chapter, so basically what we're going to do is we're going to take what we've learned in terms of surpluses in an economy and then see how that ties in with international trade. So the title of the chapter, chapter 9, is Application International Trade. So if you are an IB major, hopefully this will be especially interesting to you. Okay, so first let me kind of set the stage in terms of how this is going to work. The way we're going to think about international trade is we're going to think about a market for a particular good being kind of split into two geographic regions. So let's think of a particular good where the particular good is widgets. There's going to be a domestic country that's going to have its own supply and demand graph for widgets. And then there's going to be all other places, which we're just going to call the world, that's going to have its own supply and demand for widgets. So basically we have one product that's being exchanged in two markets, in the domestic market and in the world market. Okay, the reason I point this out is because we're going to take the perspective that we're the domestic country, and then we're going to think about how international trade would affect our domestic market. But keep in mind there's this outside market in the world for the exact same product, widgets or rice or t-shirts or computers or whatever it is we're looking at. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to first show you kind of what would be going on in the domestic market if there was not trade. And then we're going to use that as a baseline to compare welfare effects in that same domestic country if they then decided to engage in trade. So to start with, let's think about the equilibrium without trade. Okay, again, this is from the perspective of the domestic country. So you don't have to have a particular country, it's just we're going to have a domestic country and the rest of the world, and you can anchor the domestic country at whatever country you want to think of. Okay, so the domestic country without trade is going to have a supply and demand. This is going to be identical to the supply and demand that we have been drawing over and over again, except we're going to explicitly label this as the domestic supply and the domestic demand. Okay, if there is no trade in the domestic country, that means whatever the domestic manufacturers produce, that's going to be the supply that we're constrained at. Whatever the domestic consumers consume, that's going to be what we're constrained at. So this domestic market is going to have an equilibrium price. And what we're going to get is that if there's no trade, then the consumers in this domestic market are going to have a surplus that is equivalent to the area of the triangle that sits above the domestic price and below the domestic demand. So this would be kind of domestic consumer surplus, this whole area in here. And likewise, the home manufacturers or the home suppliers are going to have a domestic producer surplus that is equivalent to the area of the triangle, where the triangle is the space below the domestic price and above the domestic supply. Okay, so nothing new going on here. So this is all old news. We're just explicitly labeling everything with a domestic tag on it. Okay, so as a result, in the home country, if there's no trade that happens, then the total surplus for the home country is just going to be the area of this entire big triangle, and then this would be total surplus in domestic country. This would kind of be like the size of the pie that is eaten by the domestic country. So again, this kind of relates to efficiency. So without trade, however big this whole thing is, that's kind of how much welfare is realized in total in the domestic country. Okay, so this is the equilibrium without trade. Now what we're going to do is we're going to think about what would change in terms of the equilibrium if the domestic country decided to go ahead and engage in trade. Okay, so again, if the domestic country decides to engage in trade, then there's only kind of two groups in this simple framework. There's the domestic country and the world. And so if the domestic country trades, then they have to trade with the world. Okay, so this is with international trade. And again, this is from the perspective of the domestic country. Okay, I'm going to give you some bullet points here to just kind of describe in words what will happen, and then I'll show it to you on the graph. Okay, so the first thing that's going to kind of be true if this domestic country decides to trade with the world is that instead of there being one relevant price, which was previously just the one equilibrium price in the domestic country, there's now going to exist two prices that are relevant. So price number one is going to be the price of the good in the domestic country, which is what we just plotted. And then price number two that's going to be relevant is the price of the good in that other market in the world. So, so there's going to exist, backwards E, two prices. And the two prices are, number one, the domestic price, and number two, the world price. Okay, so let's think about this in terms of widgets, for example. So suppose the domestic country has its own market for widgets. They have some equilibrium price in their market. The rest of the world also manufactures widgets. They have some world price in their market. There's going to be two different prices that exist. One of these two prices is probably going to be larger than the other price. So based on which one of these two is larger, that's going to tell us kind of what the trade should look like or how it should be characterized. So one of two things could be true. The domestic price could be greater than the world price, or the world price could be greater than the domestic price. So let's just consider each case. First of all, if the domestic price is less than the world price, then the domestic country should export the good. Okay, if the domestic country is exporting the good, that means they're going to take some of the widgets that they make and send it to the rest of the world. The world, in turn, is going to import the good. Okay, let's just kind of like do an intuition check here to see if this makes sense. Okay, suppose we have some product like iPads, where, actually that's a bad example. Let's suppose we have some product like motorcycles. And in the domestic country, the price of motorcycles is less than the price of motorcycles in the rest of the world. Well, if that's true, then that kind of tells us that the domestic country is kind of relatively more efficient at making the good, and because they can kind of make the good at a less costly amount, they can sell it at a less costly amount. And the rest of the world, the prices are really high because they're not as efficient at making the good. If that's true, then what the domestic country should do is they should kind of take ownership of that good and say, like, we're pretty good at making motorcycles, and as a result we have low prices here. Why don't we just take this good that we can make kind of cheaply and sell cheaply and export it to the rest of the world where you don't make it as efficiently, and so you have to pay a higher price. Okay, so this is the first thing that could be true. So the domestic price could be less than the world price. In that case, the domestic country should export. Okay, if the reverse were true, and if the domestic price were greater than the world price, then we should see the opposite. So in this case, the domestic country should import the good from the rest of the world. Okay, think about why this is the case, and then we'll use rice as an example. So suppose in the rest of the world, rice is like super, super cheap, But in America, the price, or in the domestic country, the price of rice is kind of high because we're not really suited to making rice. Okay, if that's the case, then what should the domestic country America do? We should just import rice from the rest of the world because it's super cheap overseas. So we should capitalize on that and bring it in from the rest of the world that's relatively more efficient at producing it. Okay, if the domestic country kind of follows these rules, and if they decide to export when their own price is relatively low and import when their own price is relatively high, then what's going to happen in the domestic market is that the domestic market is just going to assume the price that exists in the other market, the world market, and so the world market is just going to become the price on the world market is just going to become the price in the domestic market as well. Okay, so in words, what this means is that after importing or exporting, in other words, trading, the domestic price will rise or fall to the world price. Okay, so that means if originally the domestic price is relatively low and they decide to export, well, as soon as they export, the domestic price is going to shoot up to the world price. Conversely, if the domestic price starts out relatively large compared to the world price and the domestic country imports, then they're going to have their price kind of sink down to the world price. So basically, after the trade, whatever the world price is, that's going to be the price that's going to kind of prevail in the domestic market. Okay, so that's going to change consumer and producer surplus in the domestic market. So let me draw this all out for you, and then hopefully all the words will start clicking a little bit. Okay, so let's first consider international trade in an exporting country, or when the domestic country is exporting. Okay, if that's the case, then what's going to happen is that the domestic market is going to have some domestic demand. They're going to have some domestic supply. And recall that they only export when the world price is above the domestic price. So if this is the price on the domestic market, then we're only going to see the domestic country exporting if the world price is higher than this. So let's just assume that the world price is somewhere up here. So I'm just going to draw a bar, and the bar is going to represent the world price. Okay, now let's think about what would happen. Okay, if the world price, again, is above the domestic price, then, well, the home country, the domestic country, is going to decide to export the good. Why would they decide to export the good? The reason they're going to decide to export the good is because once they trade and they assume the world price, at that world price, the domestic demand is going to be less than the domestic supply. So once this world price is assumed, we've got a surplus. So we've got home manufacturers making more than the home consumers can kind of consume. And so they're going to take this surplus or this export, this excess, and they're going to export it. So whatever the horizontal distance is between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied at home at the world price, that's going to be the number of units that the domestic country decides to export to the rest of the world. Okay, now let's think about how this affects the participants in the home market. So what we said is that after trade, again, the home country, the domestic country, just takes the world price. So this is kind of bad news for consumers at home, because consumers at home have a surplus that is equal to the triangle that's underneath the demand and above the price. Well, if the domestic country assumes this price, then that means that the domestic consumers are going to have this little triangle up here as their consumer surplus. This is going to be domestic consumer surplus. However, this is great news for home manufacturers, because for suppliers, their surplus is equivalent to the triangle that's underneath the prevailing price, which is now the world price, and above the supply. So the whole big triangle here is all going to be producer surplus for the domestic producers. Okay, there's kind of two things to note here. And this is going to relate to the discussion we had last class about efficiency versus equity. Okay, once the international trade has happened and the home country has exported the good, well, the price rises, and when the price rises, this changes the surpluses in the market. Recall that before the trade happened, the total surplus was equal to the area of this triangle. And this region right here, which is now shaded, was not shaded before. So that means the total surplus under trade is this whole area, which is larger than what it was without trade. So first thing to kind of note is that with trade, there is more efficiency. And that's because the total surplus has increased. We've picked up this little area here, which previously we weren't kind of getting in surplus without trade. However, with trade, there's less equity. Okay, why do we see that? Okay, before there was trade, this was the price in the home country, the domestic country. This triangle here was the consumer surplus. Now consumer surplus is just the little blue triangle. So there's less equity because consumer surplus has fallen, and at the same time, producer surplus has increased. So before trade, producer surplus was the area of this triangle here. Now with trade, producer surplus is this whole big red triangle, which clearly is bigger. So producer surplus has increased. Okay, so summarization really quickly is that with this type of trade, with exporting, the economy becomes more efficient, so the whole pie increases in size, but the economy is less equitable. So although the pie is bigger, the slices are cut so that they're not quite as fair across the different participants in the market. Okay, think about how this relates to public policy, things that you might be hearing about. If we're thinking about manufacturing in the United States, manufacturing in the United States it's really great for manufacturers when they can take the good, produce it in America, and ship it overseas. So home manufacturers really benefit when America, for example, exports goods. But it comes at the expense of home consumers, so American consumers, kind of suffering when we export, because if we as a home country are exporting goods overseas, and that can cause us to kind of command a higher price. And so the Americans in turn also have to kind of pay the higher price for the good. Okay, so that is what the graph would look like if there is exporting that's happening. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to consider international trade in importing countries. Okay, so case number 2. So we're still with international trade, so now we're going to consider international trade in importing countries. Okay, if the home country imports the good, then we start out with the original domestic demand, the original domestic supply, and recall that a home country will only import a good if the domestic price so the price on the domestic market, is greater than the world price. Okay, if that's true, then the world price is going to have to be somewhere down here. So let's just say that the world price is right there. Okay, recall that after trade happens, the domestic country just kind of assumes the world price. So if trade happens, the domestic country is suddenly going to have to use this kind of blue price, the world price, as the price that it faces. And so at this blue price, the quantity that's supplied by domestic producers is going to be kind of low, and the quantity that is demanded by domestic consumers is going to be kind of high. So again, this makes sense because like if the rest of the world is kind of relatively good at producing something, and so the price in the rest of the world is cheap, and then we kind of start importing that cheap thing from the other countries, the rest of the world, then consumers at home are going to like those lower prices, so they're going to demand more. But suppliers at home who are making that thing, like, they're not as good at making it, which is why the price is originally high in the domestic country. And so at that low price, they're going to be willing to supply less. Okay, so what this means is that there's going to be a surplus in the domestic country because, a shortage in the domestic country because the home consumers are going to demand more than the home manufacturers can produce. And so as a result, the domestic country is going to have to import this many units. Okay, now let's think about surpluses. So trade has happened. The domestic country has imported this many units because at this new price, they're kind of short some. And so this is the new price that prevails in the domestic market. So consumer surplus is going to be the area that's underneath the demand curve and above the new price. So this whole big triangle here is going to have an area that's equal to the new consumer surplus after trade has happened and the importing country has, the domestic country has imported. Okay, on the other hand, producer surplus is going to not be as big as it used to be. So originally, when this was the equilibrium, producers got this amount of surplus. With the trade, the price has fallen to the world price, and so producer surplus is now bounded by the little triangle that's below the lower price and above the supply curve. So this is going to be producer surplus in the domestic market. And now let's kind of make some statements about welfare. Okay, so same as before when we were looking at exports. When trade happens and there's importing, there is more efficiency. And again, we see this because total surplus is now higher. So before the trade, total surplus was just this triangle right here. After the trade, the total surplus is this whole area of consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So in other words, after the trade, we kind of pick up this little area here that previously nobody was getting. Okay, but same as before, there's going to be less equity. But this time, the reverse parties are going to kind of be helped or be hurt. So when importing happens, the consumer surplus rises. So consumer surplus goes up because previously, again, it used to be just this little triangle here. Now it's this big green triangle. But producer surplus falls relative to when there was no trade, because when there's no trade, again, producer surplus was this area. Now it's this little dinky area. Okay, so let's tell the kind of the political story here. So the idea is if we import goods from overseas, so if we import tires from Mexico, this is really great for Americans in the United States who need to buy tires, because if we're importing tires from Mexico where they're really cheap, then home consumers get to like assume that cheap price and consumer surplus blows up. But if we import cheap tires from Mexico, this is like bad news for tire manufacturers in the United States, and producer surplus as a result falls when we import the good. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to kind of tack on here is how all of this would be affected if a tariff was slapped on the market. So let me first just define a tariff so that everybody's on the same page, just in terms of terminology. Basically, I'll start with this. So basically a tariff is a tax, but it's a tax that's exclusive to international trade. So let me give you the definition. Okay, so a tariff is a tax on goods that are produced abroad and sold domestically. So, okay, so what this means is that tariffs are only going to be relevant for imports. So the idea is if America brings in tires from Mexico, they import them, then a tariff would be a tax on those tires that are produced abroad in Mexico and sold domestically in the United States. So again, just so you don't lose sight of this, this is only relevant for imports. Okay, let me tell you what tariffs would do in terms of words, and I'll draw you the pictures. Okay, if a tariff is slapped on every unit that's imported from another country, then what that means is that because the domestic consumers, or because that tax has to be paid on top of the price that the good is exchanged at, then when we think about the price changing, there's going to kind of be two changes in the price. So let's suppose we're the domestic country. Let's suppose we decide to import tires. Okay, as soon as we import, the price for tires domestically is going to fall to the world price. That's price change number one. But then if a tariff is slapped on the tires, then on top of the world price, we're going to have to pay the tariff. And so the price will move up from the world price by the amount of the tariff. Okay, so let me write and I'll show you a picture of this. So tariffs cause the domestic price to rise above the world price by the amount of the tariff. Okay, so now picture time. Okay, so again, tariffs are only relevant for scenarios where the domestic country is importing. So we can kind of, off the bat, kind of draw the graph in a particular way. So this is going to be, label it international trade with tariff. Okay, so the way this is going to work is we start out with the domestic demand and the domestic supply. And if we're thinking about tariffs, and that means the home country has to be importing. If they're importing, that means the world price is below the equilibrium price in the domestic country. So if this is the price in the domestic country, then that means the world price has to be somewhere below it. So let's just say it's right here. Okay, this graph will be helpful to draw super neatly on your paper because there's going to be lots of moving components. Okay, what we said is that if this is what's going on and then the government slaps a tariff on imports, then this is going to cause the domestic price to rise above the world price by the amount of the tariff. So in other words, the home country decides to engage in trade. They assume this low world price, but then because the tariff has to be paid on top of the world price, the price effectively is just going to increase by the amount of the tariff. And so we're going to get kind of this other price, and we're going to call this price the post-tariff price. Okay, that means that this world price effectively isn't super relevant anymore because we have to like up it by the amount of the tariff that has to be paid. Okay, now let's think about how this affects surpluses. So consumer surplus in the domestic country, again, is the area that's below the domestic demand curve and above the price. Well, if this is the new relevant price, the post-tariff price, then consumer surplus is going to have a base that's down here, and then it's going to be bounded by the original domestic demand curve. So this is going to be consumer surplus in the domestic country when the tariff is there. Okay, let's now think about producer surplus in the home country. So in the domestic country, the producer surplus is the area that's underneath the relevant price and above the supply curve. So this is now the relevant price, and here's the supply curve. So this area in here is going to be producer surplus. Okay, one thing to just kind of note is that if the tariff wasn't here, then the price would be down at this dotted line. So if the tariff wasn't here, then the consumer surplus would be all the way down to this dotted line, and the producer surplus would be stunted at this dotted line. And so if the tariff wasn't here, this whole area would have been realized as surplus for the consumers. But because the tariff is here and we have to bump the price up, this area, which consumers used to get without the tariff, is now gone. Okay, but there's one extra little relevant area in here. Okay, recall when we were talking about taxes that somebody gets the money from the tariff or the tax. So the government tax revenue, or tariff revenue in this case, is always equal to the number of units that are exchanged times the amount of the tax or the amount of the tariff. Okay, so what that means is if this is the relevant price, and at this price, this is the number of units that are demanded domestically, this is the number of units that are supplied domestically, then this little leg here will be the number of units that are imported. And we have that, that's the number of units that are imported. So that would be, so the government tax revenue, just write this out so I can have comparison, is equal to the number of units that are exchanged, or in this case imported, times the tax. So this is the Q. This is the number of units that are exchanged, or these are the number of units that are taxable because these are the number of units that are imported. And then the amount of tax, again, is just the vertical distance here. So this is the tax. So what that means is that this area that coincides with the rectangle is going to be equal to the government tax revenue. Again, the reason for that is because the base of this rectangle is equal to the number of imports, or the quantity. The height of the rectangle is equal to the amount of the tariff, T. And so this black rectangle is going to have an area that coincides with the government tax revenue. So again, if you have to calculate this on an exam, hint, what you would do is you would figure out the number of units that are imported after the price rises. You would multiply that by the amount of the tariff, and that would give you the government tax revenue under a tariff. Okay, now let's just think about kind of surpluses. So when the tariff is slapped on the market that is trading, what happens? Well, total surplus, which is now the green triangle plus the red triangle plus the black rectangle, it's less than the amount of surplus that existed without the tariff, because without the tariff, this whole area right here was consumer surplus, but now nobody gets this triangle and nobody gets this triangle. So the tariff actually constricts the market in terms of efficiency. However, the tariff does help in terms of equity, because before the tariff was here, this whole triangle here was consumer surplus, and this dinky little triangle here was producer surplus. But with the tariff, the bottom triangle kind of becomes larger, the top triangle shrinks a little bit. So the tariff, it helps with equity, but again, it comes at the expense of efficiency. Okay, if you haven't read this chapter, go back in the textbook and read it so you can just kind of get double exposure to it. We'll break for 10 minutes, and then after that, we'll come back and practice this in the exercise. Okay, for today's exercise, suppose you've got the following situation. Suppose there's a domestic country that has a demand that's characterized by this equation. The domestic country has a supply that's characterized by this equation. And then answer the following questions. And I'm going to help you a lot with these, so just kind of hang tight for a minute. Question number 1, suppose the world price is 35. The question is, should the domestic country import or export and how many units? Question number 2 is, if we change the world price to 25, should the domestic country export or import and how many units? And then the last question is, if the world price is $15 and the domestic country trades and imposes a tariff of $5, then you need to calculate consumer surplus, producer surplus, and government tax revenue in the domestic country. Okay, these are hard questions, so I'm going to walk you through them a little bit. Okay, the first thing that's going to be important for you to calculate is, what is the domestic price? So to figure out the domestic price that you can compare it to the world price, you need to find the equilibrium P in the market. So I'm just going to do this for you. So this is like step number 1 handed to you. So to find domestic price, we're just going to take the demand and supply and set them equal to each other. So you're going to have negative 1/4 Q plus 40 equal to 1/2 Q plus 10. If you move the 10 over here, you'll get 30. If you move the 1/4 over here, you're going to get 3/4 Q. So Q is going to be equal to 40. Now to get the price, you would take this 40 and you would plug it into either this equation or this equation. Doesn't matter which one you choose, you're going to get a price of 30. So this means that this is the equilibrium in the domestic market before they trade. Okay, now let me help you with number 1. So with number 1, what's going to be easiest to do is to plot this with the equilibrium and then kind of add in the components. So on your piece of paper, draw this large. I don't have space to draw it large. But what you need to draw is the domestic demand, which has an intercept at 40. And then if the slope is negative 1/4, that means you're going to go down 1/4, down 1/4, and you're going to hit this axis at 160. The domestic supply has an intercept at 10. It has a slope of 1/2. And we just calculated the equilibrium. So the equilibrium here is going to be at 40, and then the price is going to be at 30. Okay, for question 1, what you need to do is you need to take the world price of 35 and first of all just draw it on the graph. So have a world price of 35 and then draw a bar up here. Okay, the question is, should the domestic country import or export? So all you need to know to answer this question is whether 35 is bigger or smaller than the domestic price of 30. That answers the import-export component. And then the how many, to answer the how many, what you would do is you would take this world price of 35, you would plug it into the domestic demand equation to get a number for there. You would plug the 35 into the domestic supply equation to get a number for there. You would subtract these two numbers, and that answers how many. Okay, for question number 2, it's the exact same idea, but we're just changing the world price. So for question number 2, I have told you that the world price is now $25. So the same original graph still works, but what you need to do now is take a world price of 25 and draw that into your little graph. And then you compare the 25 to the 30, depending on which one's bigger. That answers whether the domestic country should import or export. To answer the how many components, you need to take the world price of 25, plug it into the domestic demand. If you plug 25 into the domestic demand, that will give you a number for the domestic demand. quantity demanded. You'll take the 25 world price, plug it into the domestic supply. That will give you a number that coincides with this value for how many units the domestic country will supply. You'll subtract these two numbers. That will answer how many for question 2. Okay, for question 3, which is harder. Let me just draw you a real big picture down the bottom here. So for question 3, you can still use the same picture. So just gonna enlarge it to make sure all the shapes are visible. So for question 3, you've got the domestic demand that has an intercept up here at 40, domestic supply that has an intercept at 10. You know that the domestic price before trade is 30. And now the question says the world price is 15. So you're going to have a world price equal to 15. You're going to draw that here. And then it says the domestic country imposes a tariff of $5. So recall if there's a tariff, then what happens is the world price just goes up by the amount of the tariff. So you're going to go up by tariff equals 5. That means the world price plus the tariff is going to be 20. So at 20, you're going to have a bar there. This 20 is now the relevant price. So you can kind of disregard that bar. Okay, so the questions now are, with this going on, what is consumer surplus in the domestic market? Well, consumer surplus in the domestic market is going to be the area that is below the demand curve and above the new relevant price, which is the world price plus the tariff. So the consumer surplus is a triangle. So the area of a triangle is 1/2 base times height. The base of that triangle coincides with this quantity right here. Okay, think about what this quantity is. This quantity is a quantity that you would get if you took a price of 20 and you plugged it into the demand curve. So you take the demand curve, you plug in 20 for the price, a Q will come out of that. That's the Q here. That's the base of this triangle. The height of this triangle, well, the triangle starts at 40, it goes down to 20. That means the height of the triangle is 20. And then you have all the components you need for consumer surplus. Okay, for producer surplus, the producer surplus is the area that's underneath the relevant price, which is now 20, and above the supply curve. So this would be producer surplus. Okay, producer surplus is a triangle. The base of the triangle is going to coincide with this particular quantity. Okay, think about what this quantity is. This quantity is the amount that would be supplied at a price of 20. So to get this Q, you go up to the supply curve, you put 20 in for the price, a Q will spit out. That will give you this Q, which is the base of this triangle here. Okay, the height of this triangle, well, the triangle starts at 20, it goes down to 10, because this is the intercept, so the height of this triangle is 10. So now you have a base, you have a height, you divide it by 2, you have the area of that triangle. Okay, the last little bit here is you're supposed to calculate the government tax revenue. Okay, recall that the tax revenue, the government tax revenue is equal to the quantity that's imported times the tariff. Okay, the quantity that's imported is going to be this area right here, or this number. So you've already calculated these two Q's, you just subtract them. That gives you the quantity of imports. So this distance goes with that. The height of this rectangle here is the amount of the tariff, which is $5. So to calculate the government tax revenue, you're going to take the difference between these two Q's, which is the base of the rectangle, multiply it by 5, which is the height of the rectangle, and that gives you the government tax revenue. Okay, I know this is a little bit difficult, so give it your best shot. Put in your responses before the end of class, and then make sure you kind of review the answers that pop up so that you're well prepared for the exam, which is coming up next week. If you're unclear, let me know. Also, I highly recommend that you take advantage of the SI sessions that are coming up, just because that will be a great review for the exam. And that's all I've got for you, so enjoy the rest of your day.